name is Megan Murphy, Director of Developer Marketing at Particle. I'm so excited for this conversation and the folks that we have up here on stage. There is this unique space where within IoT, how people are using technologies to gather data and where that intersects with, of course, gathering data from the environment, but also how it starts to then create social impact, whether it's giving back to the environment, whether it's creating change in society and communities. So very excited to dig in this conversation today. I'll just do a quick introduction of our panelists and we'll dive right in. Sound good? Great. So to my left, we have David Hagan, who is a PhD candidate with MIT. Next to him, Phil Bresnahan, who is an oceanographer and engineer at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. And then on the end, we have Tommy Miles, who's Director of System Integration at EnviroFit. And I'd love to just, get the folks in the room familiar with the products that you're building. And actually, starting on the end with you, Tommy, during the keynote, we talked a little bit, Zach talked a little bit about EnviroFit and what they were doing with this innovative, cooking products and measuring the usefulness of that once they've deployed out into people's homes. But you also have another product where you're leveraging IoT. So what are you working on right now?
Yeah, so our next product, so our first product was that stove monitoring usage. We have 1,000 units out in Honduras and Mexico. And they've been out for over a year now, gathering data, getting good feedback there. Our second product that we just launched a couple months ago is called Smart Gas. And it's different than our traditional model, which focuses on wood and charcoal for cooking. And efficiencies there, and kind of bringing people up the energy ladder into LPG, which is essentially propane. And so what we've done is we've created this metering valve that we stick on top of a propane or LPG tank. And we allow customers to not just not have to buy the whole cylinder and the gas and the regulator and all of that, but enable them to pay in daily increments. And so what this does is it gets our customers who are in energy poverty cooking on biomass into a cleaner, more effective and safer, better fuel gas. So much more suited for indoor air quality and the like. So yeah, that's a really exciting product. We had piloted in Ghana and Kenya. And we're launching our second gen in Kenya and moving to India next year.
Fantastic. Phil, lifelong surfer. In fact, we have some great videos of you surfing here in San Francisco.
Some baby waves.
Hey now. Yeah, not as big as SoCal. How did you find yourself building a connected surf product?
I ask myself that all the time, to be honest with you. First of all, thanks for the opportunity to be here and talk about SmartFin and oceanographic research in a kind of unique setting for us. But my background's in chemical sensor design for oceanography. I've been studying different contaminants in seawater for about the last 10 years. Started in graduate school, and I was originally building some more on the order of $10,000 to $20,000 sensors for studying carbon dioxide that ends up dissolving in seawater and trying to figure out how that's affecting the marine ecosystem and the sort of trickle-down effects on all the organisms in seawater. And I was bringing a lot of people on lab tours and showing them different experiments in our chemistry laboratory. And to be totally honest, I saw a lot of people just zoning out. It just wasn't really hitting the mark in the way that I wanted it to. And so I thought if I could connect my interests in oceanography and chemical sensing with my passion for outdoor sports and water sports, it would be a really cool way to show not just something that everybody could relate to, but also the way that I think I got interested in oceanography in the first place, which was, again, my love for nature and being outside. And so I started making these sensors smaller and smaller and cheaper, and eventually learned we kind of hit this breaking point where we couldn't get things all that much cheaper using the technology that we had, and we couldn't get them to be user-friendly enough with the technology that we had, so we switched paths pretty significantly and took, instead of miniaturizing the sensors that we had, we started working from the ground up and working on surfboard fins and putting new sensors into those. So now we're working on the Smart Fin project, which is a temperature, motion, and GPS sensor combo. And we're working on new sensors to put pH for acidification. Ocean acidification is a major problem. Chlorophyll for algae blooms, dissolved oxygen to basically measure how fish are breathing in and out and using the oxygen in seawater. And trying to miniaturize those sensors so that they can fit on the surfboard fins. And then giving them out to surfers so that they can collect data and contribute to the environment that they're spending all of their time in anyway, just by being in the water.
Fantastic. Making it easy for other people to essentially contribute to what you're doing.
That's the goal. And it makes it easy for me to go surfing and call it work.
There you go. There you go. Thank you.
Thank you.
And David, I mean, you just flew in from China, right? Japan, yes. So you've been traveling the world, deploying these really fascinating air sensor products that are measuring air quality. What are some of the key things that you're doing right now with your research?
So we've got several different air quality networks set up across the world right now, kind of depending on various grants and projects. That's kind of how the academic world works. But most of our work, or my work at least, is actually based in India. So measuring urban air quality in Delhi. And then we also have a fairly large project in Hawaii. So for the last 3 years or so, we've had a fairly large distributed network of sensors across the Big Island, measuring volcanic gases and particles. And we kind of kicked it up into a second gear in May with the increased eruption in the lower East Rift Zone in Hawaii. And that was a bit different of a project since it wasn't so science-focused. It was much more community-focused and providing real-time data to people that needed it to make decisions, and also working with the kind of key decision makers, the EPA disaster response team and some others that were trying to decide when to go and evacuate people from these areas. And so that was a pretty cool project.
Was that something when the eruption started, your team initiated working with the EPA and the government, or did they reach out because they had saw you deployed all of these sensors? Yeah,
it was a couple different things. So we have a fairly large EPA grant to design and build this large network on Hawaii that was supposed to start this fall. And we've been working there for a few years, and specifically working with the Hawaii Department of Health and some community members, so mostly elementary and middle schools. And in May, when the eruption took off, the community members were actually the ones that reached out to us and said, hey, can you speed this up a little bit? So we went from kind of design to producing 50 new sensors and deploying them within 2 weeks, which was a lot of work. And it wasn't actually until we got there, really, or actually just before we got there, that the government reached out. The Department of Health was already familiar with us, and so they actually, for the first week of the eruption, our sensors were the only ones that were actually in the kind of evacuation zone. Because the one Department of Health monitoring station, which are these $150,000 really nice stations, it immediately lost power and communications due to the lava flows. And so they were able to take the ones that we already had on the island and move them into the areas they needed, and get information that they needed to make those decisions before the EPA could move in with their own sensors.
Right. Lava, I guess, is a pretty tough environmental force to build around.
Yeah, it was a challenge. Haven't quite gotten them to be lava-proof yet.
Lava, that's a tough challenge. But I mean, you're all deploying products in pretty tough environmental. water is one of the tough, maybe not as tough as lava, but water.
Yeah, lava wins.
Lava's tough.
I can argue with that.
And then, of course, I mean, just having it really in people's homes, making sure people can use the product without perhaps breaking the product in a lot of ways. I mean, what are some of these implementation challenges that you're thinking about when you're building these products? What are the technical choices that you're making to ensure your product doesn't turn into flames?
Yeah, so lava I'm not going to
Well,
really
yeah.
try and design around that. However, in Hawaii, our biggest problem has actually been the acidity of the particles. So,
Interesting.
the particles in Hawaii are pretty much just little liquid droplets of sulfuric acid. So pHs of -2, -1. And when that deposits on your electron, bad things happen. And so we've got lots of fun pictures of electrons that are just totally oxidized, and traces on circuit boards just completely gone. And it's
Sure.
pretty challenging to deal with that. You either have to design your enclosure in a very sealed way or coat them somehow. And that's something we also deal with in India, where in Delhi, ambient temperatures can exceed 50 degrees Celsius. And there aren't that many electronics designed off the shelf to really withstand those kinds of temperatures and humidities for long periods of time. And so learning a lot about kind of these medical grade coatings and stuff that you can get to put on PCBs, and just sighting things better in the shade and stuff like that.
Right. And I know, Phil, with the SmartFin, you went through quite a few iterations and making sure that you're protecting the connectivity that's in the fin.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of our biggest constraints is size, and specifically the thinness of the fin. We want to make sure that the fin doesn't change performance that the surfer is used to, so it has to fit the exact same form factor of any other surfboard fin. And those fins tend to be about 6 or 7 millimeters at their maximum thickness, and then much thinner at the edges. So finding components that could fit in that, and the batteries especially, those are pretty challenging. A lot of circuits, just individual components can be taller than that. So fitting something in that size is tough. And then with the sensors, as soon as we have exposed sensors, meaning the temperature sensor can actually be potted into the fin itself. It's covered in epoxy and fiberglass, and so that one's pretty safe. But something like pH or chlorophyll fluorescence or dissolved oxygen needs to be exposed directly to the environment that it's sensing. But that also means it's exposed to the sand particles that surfers are throwing their boards into, and truck beds and whatever. So it gets abused quite a bit. And trying to figure out ways to make something robust enough for the surfer who doesn't really want to change his or her behavior all that much, but just go for surf and then have the thing help environmental scientists. That's definitely a pretty big challenge. So not sure we've figured it all out yet, but it's not lava, so.
It's not lava. If there's one takeaway from this conversation, stay away from lava. Of course, with all of this, all of these products, you're collecting data. You're either paying attention to how your end user is leveraging the product, or you're measuring the quality of the air and leveraging using that data for the safety of the community as well. With some of these, it feels like you go into it knowing perhaps the trends that you're looking for, the data you want to collect, but often perhaps you see things you would have never realized or that's surprising. So I'm just curious, and maybe even Tommy specifically with the initiatives that you ran, was there really surprising data points you never would have realized you gather?
Some of the, with our smart gas initiative, we have a lot of early data, but the suggestions are being a new technology and going into these communities that don't necessarily have a lot of technology, how they're interacting with the devices. They're almost, there can be some, I guess they could be timid to use it, so they don't know how to quite use it. There's a lot of issues around safety, and so we're seeing interesting usage patterns where they might just start boiling tea, like boiling water for tea in the morning, and that's all they use it for. And then they start, making beans and rice and cooking longer on it because they're getting used to the technology. And so seeing some of those patterns change over time, over a few months, was kind of interesting. We thought everyone would just completely abandon their old cooking technologies and go to gas, but there were some interesting focus groups after the first couple weeks or whatever.
Sure.
to figure out why people weren't using it as much as we thought they might.
How did you end up using those results and kind of early data signals?
We have been transitioning that into kind of the consumer education and figuring out the pain points to the customer, why they aren't doing it. Is it the mobile money interaction? Is it the latency to cook, or even the alarms that we give off, like buzzers and stuff, that could be annoying to the customer. You're getting low on credit, please top up. And so those are the things that we thought, at our desk in Fort Collins, Colorado, that wasn't going to be an issue. But once you actually put it on the field, you get a lot of good user feedback.
Yeah. And I'm sure, David, with what you're doing, you're planning, you're researching, you're back in the States, then you're deploying around the world. And how are you using the data that you're collecting? Is it different in different communities, how they prefer to leverage it?
Yeah, so each project is kind of unique. We actually only have one project right now that's public facing, and that is the Hawaii project. The other ones are all private at this point for various reasons. Some are government limitations, some are working with a partner who wants to keep it private for now or whatever. So they're each a bit different. It's been really surprising to learn how people in Hawaii are choosing to use this information. And we made it as open as possible, and there's a nice API you can tap into if you're so inclined. And we've had several people that have kind of built different things on top of that data, and that's been really cool to see happen.
Yeah. What have people built on it?
So there's a couple of them are just fairly basic, different iPhone apps and stuff for looking at the data. There's a high school teacher in Pahoa in Hawaii that has built this low-cost SO2 scrubbing system for homes, and so he was tapping into that to see when to turn it on and stuff like that. So that was pretty interesting. And for the last several years, it's actually been used by some of the middle and elementary schools in a couple of communities in Hawaii to see when they need to pull students inside into the gym, which actually is outfitted with an SO2 scrubbing system.
Okay.
Because these conditions change really rapidly. It's all driven by the meteorology, and the only systems that exist on the island that are run by the government provide hourly data. And for some of the stuff, that just doesn't cut it. And
Wow.
So that's been really interesting.
That is interesting. Yeah, especially if educators in schools, I don't know if you imagine they would be using it this way, but it's pretty inspiring.
Yeah, it's definitely very different than a typical day as a grad student. So.
On that topic of knowing how people might end up, whether it's using the data or using the product that you put out to market, Phil, when we were on the phone, we were talking about how when you initially launched the early version of SmartFin, and you assumed people would interact with it a certain way, and then it was not that way, and you had to kind of go back to the drawing board.
Yeah, that has been a really important part of the learning process. And at first it was a little disappointing. The first version of SmartFin had a Bluetooth chip in it. And we have a custom mobile app, and people would come back from their surf session and sync it up with the app. And then the app would send all the data to the cloud. And our cloud database is all open, so any scientist could use it. And our early adopters were all Surfrider members, and so sort of declared ocean health advocates from the beginning. And so we thought these people who were interested in surfing and interested in environmental health would take this extra step of syncing the data with their phone, and we were wrong. Some people did. The really great power users definitely did, but there were a lot of people who for whom that little barrier was enough to stop them from using the technology at all. They stopped uploading data, maybe they stopped charging the fin as well. And so we transitioned to cellular and to particle in particular so that we could have the data sent autonomously. As soon as people get back in from the water, the fin knows that it's on land, it knows that it's dry, and it sends all the data to the cloud. So that's one huge improvement that we've already seen. Kind of takes that burden out of the surfer's hands, and any burden that we can remove or any barrier that we can remove stands to be a huge boost in usability and how often they're used and how much data we're able to collect.
Right. essentially the theory of real IoT and work.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
at work, yeah. Let's talk about business models, because we have three really interesting models here. We have education and research. We have essentially a consumer product in some ways. And then, EnviroFit also is a for-profit business, but clearly has social impact. And I'm curious, I think, from a either consumer or for-profit focus, though built around social impact, what are the challenges with building a business around what you're doing so you can sustain what you're doing?
So EnviroFit had transitioned from a nonprofit organization to a for-profit organization before I joined. Primarily, I think the reason was funding. It was a lot easier for them to acquire funding, get investors, and we really wanted to keep, obviously, the social enterprise. So we continue to hire local. We do as much in-country manufacturing as we can, and so I think our model is really, if we can make it sustainable, we can create a culture within each community that they want to buy the products and use the products because they're building the products, and it kind of gets that synergy going.
Right.
And we can support the community that way rather than perpetually relying on grants and those kind of subsidized programs. And so there's a balance there because we need those grants and programs to do new innovative things. But being in the emerging markets in sub-Saharan Africa, it's very hard to charge a premium for a product when people just don't have the money. That's what talks. So keeping our costs as low as possible while still being able to innovate is a fine balance. But there are challenges with both. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I know similar for you, Phil, just producing something that is low cost but so affordable that surfers want to purchase and then surf with, contribute to.
Yeah, and so far we've been funded exclusively through a philanthropic donation. So we're still keeping it in the fairly pure research space. We are exploring other business models to figure out how to move beyond there. I really liked Zach's comment earlier on the basketball example, where there's a lot of stuff out there that you could put a smart device in or a network device, but it doesn't mean that we have to. And so we're trying to be really careful to make sure that we're providing some real value, both to the surfer, but also to environmental scientists, to municipalities and government entities, to wastewater dischargers, to any group that might need the type of information that we're collecting, and not cheapen our sensors to the point that it's just maybe affordable to the end user, but not actually providing value. It might be affordable to the surfer, I should say, but not providing value to the end user of the data set. So we're constantly weighing that balance, and for that reason, we've kept things largely in the nonprofit space, or exclusively in the nonprofit space, and we're not trying to turn a profit off of it. We're trying to make sure that we can get it into as many hands as possible, which means that we do need to bring money in, of course, to keep building them and keep supplying them. But so far, we haven't gone for profit, and we don't have any plans to in the near future. So we'll see how things change and see if we go in the way of EnviroFit and find out that allows us to fundraise differently or better. But for now, we're going after government grants and philanthropic contributions, and looking at talking to municipalities that need this type of data. So, yeah,
Great.
Exploring our options. But if you know anyone with money, send them our way.
So Phil's fundraising, if you
Yep.
know someone. And then with MIT, I'm assuming research, academia.
Yeah, ours is pretty different and straightforward.
Yeah.
Write grants, get grants, hopefully, and iterate on that. But we have actually done quite a bit of work. So I'm funded by a center at MIT called the Tata Center, funded by the Tata Trusts in India. And the entire purpose of it is to essentially start a company based on your research, or to get it what they call shovel ready. So whether it's a policy idea or a company or something, so that someone can take it forward and actually have hopefully a larger impact, which is very different than traditional, just basic science research aspect of a PhD. And so we have done a good amount of talking to funders and investors and trying to do some market research and figure out really, what is the market for this kind of information and these devices. And, one of the problems with air quality is it's mostly kind of an externality problem. The people who are creating most of the pollution don't really have an incentive to pay for these types of things. And the people who really could benefit from paying for it don't necessarily have the money. Or can't really do anything about it. And so really you're talking about working with governments or government organizations, and there's a lot of value there, but it's a much more difficult buying process. So
Sure. I mean, that assumed it's a slower process, but I mean, both you, Tommy, and Dave working with governments, I mean, what's kind of been the biggest challenges there? Or surprisingly not challenging path forward?
Working with different governments it's actually quite interesting because sometimes a government will see the need for a product or information gathering, and so they just streamline it. They're the ones funding it; they just do it. And in other cases, they see a need, but have a concern with safety or certifications or this or that, and they're not really in a position themselves to do the testing, to do the qualification. So they lean a lot on other certifications like CE and those like FCC and things like that. So even though they know they want it, they're really they can be consumer focused too. They don't want cheap products to just flood their markets, and so we see a bit of both, and more so on the customer-facing products than say the stove usage program, where it wasn't customer-focused. It was essentially hidden from the customer, behind the stove to capture all the data, and those are, I guess, easier ones to do when the customer doesn't have to call the government and say this isn't working or something's broken or something like that. So we do our best to understand that and go through those channels. But when you're pioneering new products, there sometimes are no standards. With the LPG metering, one of the issues that has been raised is because we're actually metering fuel at the home rather than at the filling station. How do we calibrate, and what's the process for going through that process? Is if you put 100,000 meters out there, that's something the government can't. They don't have the capability to go do. So we're working with governments to figure out some of these regulatory constraints that these new markets are presenting.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I want to make sure we have some time for Q&A. Yeah, we'll open it up. Do you have any questions for our panelists today? Yes.
On the social impact side, is there anything that's been particularly surprising on sort of the law of unintended consequences? Where to take your cooking one, did a project in Kenya. Put a well in, the well allowed them to put bathrooms in, the bathrooms allowed them to generate biogas. They started using the biogas on this, it was actually a Catholic mission in the middle of nowhere, and it put the guys who were making charcoal out of business. I mean, that's a good thing at some level, right? Because that, it's environmentally, but it was also something, that there were parents who paid for their kids to go to the school by, with bags of charcoal, and that was now sort of not needed. So is there anything, from any of the three of you that you've seen or that you had to swerve to avoid?
Yeah, so on the cooking side, we've identified that there are a lot of illegal cross fillers and people who have, you drive down an alley and it just, they have 3 or 4 LPG cylinders, and one of our services that's included with this is because we know how much has been dispensed, we know how much is left, and we can get it so they never run out. So we're perpetually going to the customer, doing that last mile over and over. And as we scale up in dense communities, we do anticipate that there will be some pushback, yeah. So yeah.
Yeah.
One of our odd challenges is that surfing has this history of being a very soulful sport, and people want to be connected to nature itself, but not necessarily to a device that's connected to nature. And so there's some strange pushback related to that when people think that we're monitoring the surfer's behavior as opposed to monitoring the environment itself, because it takes away from the perception, at least, of being connected directly to nature in that more traditional sense. We've heard a couple comments along those lines. I don't think it's affected our actual distribution in any meaningful way at this point. But I'm interested to see when we do go to scale how that attitude does affect things. There's some other products out there that do exactly that trace. The one of them is actually called Trace, but it traces the surfer's motion, or you could use it on a snowboard, skateboard, whatever, and trace your carving down a slope or a wave. And yeah, a lot of people are pretty opposed to seeing that sort of thing in the waves.
Yeah, we haven't really had too many unintended consequences or anything. For the most part, aside from maybe it involves a lot more education on my part, or me educating people on how these things work and why, especially in India, there's a huge kind of market demand for these kind of inexpensive air quality sensors. As over the last 3-4 years, air quality has become a much bigger topic internationally in India. And so trying to explain and teach people why, this device you bought on Amazon might not be telling you what it thinks, or you think it's telling you, has been a significant chunk of my time, which is good. But absolutely, yeah.
Unforeseen.
Fantastic. Any other questions? Jeff?
Hi. All 3 of you are using IoT to fight climate change, to improve public health. So first, thank you all for the work that you do. But I find myself curious about your thoughts looking a little bit further into the future. So what does this all add up to when we're better able to understand our environment, when we're better able to share this with the communities around us, and more of these products become more proliferated? What gets you excited about 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Because you're all solving really fundamental problems that we face as a species. So what gets you out of bed in the morning, and where does this go in 5, 10, 20 years?
Well, one of the things that gets me really excited is getting people kind of literally stoked about the type of science that we're doing. Before I was working on this project, as I said, I was doing things in the lab and people were getting drowsy and falling asleep in the middle of my talks. And now I talk about surfing and how that relates to climate change, and people are much more engaged, not only in those conversations, but then they go and they talk to their friends. And as David was saying earlier, so many of these problems that we're seeing in environmental science are related to the tragedy of the commons type issues and externalities. And so the way we're going to solve a lot of them isn't necessarily through more measurements or better measurements. We know that we're changing the planet and doing so quickly and in ways that are harming ourselves. We believe that by communicating the science better through things like this and getting more people directly engaged, we'll be able to reach more people with that message. And in democratic nations, at least, that should hopefully lead to informed voting decisions, and in other places it'll allow people to lobby for things that they care about because they're actually directly engaged themselves, or they have a buddy who's engaged. So that's how I get out of bed with excitement every morning.
Yeah, it's pretty similar for us. I mean, our overarching goal, 10 years down the line, or probably much longer than that, but is to actually affect some large-scale change from the top down. Whether it's new policies or changes or whatever it is to actually improve air quality, especially in these places where you can't actually control it. Places like Delhi, Hawaii, not much we can do. Not going to cap a volcano. So, but a big part of that is getting people invested and educated on what's actually happening, what's changing. As new policies are implemented, is it actually improving the conditions? And having this data is really helpful. And traditionally, air quality monitoring at least is done by regulatory agencies. So typically have maybe a few stations in any large urban area. In Delhi, there's like 5 or 10 right now. And it gives you a good background idea of what's going on at kind of the regional scale. But we've really never been able to make these high density measurements. And there's a huge amount of spatial and temporal variability in air quality. And a lot of people just aren't really aware of that. And so making these measurements helps us understand much more about kind of human exposure and how different career choices or lifestyle choices affect that. And hopefully with education and outreach, and that will lead to policy changes down the road and will actually make a difference.
Excellent. Oh, go ahead.
Oh yeah, just real quick. One of the things that EnviroFit strives to do is bring people out of energy poverty. And so when you're out in the field and you see someone smile because they can afford gas now, they don't have to cook over charcoal and breathe those toxic fumes. That's kind of the close-in impact. But 5-10 years down the road, there are billions of people who wake up every day and have to go get their fuel. Where we take it for granted here, you turn on the switch and your stove turns on, whether it be gas or electric, and everything's really reliable. But kind of giving that access to clean, efficient energy to the next 2 or 3 billion people is kind of where we're going and what we strive to do.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us at Spectra, for coming on stage, for sharing the work that you're doing. I assume you'll probably stick around if folks have other questions.
Yeah,
They can ask you.
absolutely.
Excellent.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Cheers.